is back then, at least in the United States, you had one phone line, you got one kind of phone from the monopoly provider. Now, you've got your home phone, you've got a cell phone with 3 or 4 lines, you've got the mobility that cell phones bring. So for the same percentage of your income, you're actually able to get a much, much better product. And when we think about standard of living, when we think about rich and poor, I think one of the things we have to think about is the rising quality of so many products, right? Automobiles. If you, 25, 30 years ago, if your car lasted for 100,000 miles, that was, you threw a party. That was a cause for celebration. Today, in most of the Western world, if you don't get 100,000 out of your car, you feel like you've been ripped off. So when we look at the sort of, the changes in quality and the changes in variety of goods, you go to the grocery store, there's, in the States, there's a whole aisle full of different kinds of potato chips and tortilla chips. When I was growing up, there was like 2 kinds, right? So all these changes that we've seen are other ways of measuring wealth, that the opportunities for consumption people have available to them are much greater than they used to be. The real cost in terms of their labor time is down, and so people are able to afford all those new things that we now think of as, quote, necessities.
But hasn't that impacted savings? That's why there's no savings in these, because you spend all your money on consumer items.
Except from what we know, people are not financing that consumption by debt. I think there's a lot of reasons why the savings rate has been so low. I think part of it in the United States over the last decade was that people thought they were saving in their houses, right? That the increased asset value of their houses substituted for more traditional forms of saving. Well, it turns out that for many of them that was a big mistake, right? And what we've seen, interestingly, since the housing prices fell and the recession's come on, savings rates in the United States are going back up again, right? Because people are saying, well, I can't cash out my house anymore, so I've got to save more. So I think the distortions in the housing market that produced the housing bubble is part of the reason why we saw in the last 10 or 15 years those low savings.
Isn't savings going up, Professor, because people are now seeking to live within their means, and countries are seeking to live within their means. Easy credit in America was responsible for a lot of the economic woes that you had.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think when you look at what generated this recession and the problems we're dealing with now, looking at the cheap credit produced by the Federal Reserve post 9/11 up through the rest of the last decade, how that fueled the housing bubble that led to the crash that we found ourselves in, I think that's absolutely right. And I think what people are now realizing is that we collectively, in terms of the U.S. government can't, and state governments can't borrow anymore. Their easy credit days are over. And for families and households, they're saying, you know what, we can't rely on that credit to be there all the time. We can't rely on the housing prices to give us that value, so we've got to save ourselves more directly. I think that's exactly right. And I think it'll be an interesting question to see whether there's a long-run effect of this, whether when the economy begins to recover, do people continue to save at these same rates? One of the things we know from the Great Depression was it changed Americans' spending and saving habits in a major way, that after the Great Depression, people were much more conscious of having a nest egg, of having that fund there in case it went, in case things went south again. Be interesting to see whether that happens this time, especially with young people.
Yeah, what do you make of the assertion that greed in America was largely responsible for the depth of this recession? And professional people who are lawyers, bankers, people in the trust houses in America, that they became exceedingly greedy.
Yeah. Well, I have a friend who has an analogy to think about this. He says, look, if we discovered that there were 5 airplane crashes in one day, we wouldn't blame gravity for it, right? Gravity doesn't cause airplane crashes. Something else is causing it. Gravity's always there. And I think that's how greed works, or at least self-interest. People are always self-interested in market economies. To sort of say there was this sudden sort of outburst of greed, that doesn't really answer the question. Why did people suddenly get so greedy? What I'd rather say is it's not so much a question that people became more greedy. Rather, we adopted a set of policies that enabled people to satisfy their greed by doing things that were harmful to the economy rather than things that were beneficial. Steve Jobs and Apple Computer, they're greedy too, but they produce products that we love and that make us better off. Walmart's greedy, they want profits, right? But they produce cheap goods that enhance Americans' ability to acquire those goods. So it can't just be greed, because greed does good things too. So the question is, why was greed or self-interest turned out so bad this time?
Well, it was compounded by an unregulated financial services
Well,
sector.
I think it's just the opposite. I actually think what happened was that the financial services sector was too regulated in certain sorts of ways. And policies, say, example, the Fed keeping interest rates super low, said to people, bankers, you want to make money? Here's a low interest rate, loan it to anyone.
Yeah, your argument there is defeated because in Canada, where the market was well regulated, you didn't have the crash of a stock exchange, or you didn't have banks going out of business, insurance companies going out of business, because they had good regulations on the books. Actually, in the United States, you didn't have the proper regulations, and that is why we had the financial crisis.
Well, except there's a problem with that story, okay? There's two problems with that story. First of all, in some ways, Canadian banks are less regulated than U.S. banks. One way, importantly, is that Canadian banks have always been able to operate nationwide, and you have a smaller number of very large, stable, well-diversified banks in Canada. In the U.S., U.S. banks tend to be smaller and less well-diversified because we have this history of trying to keep banks within an individual state. And so Canada's always had a better banking system than the U.S., precisely because those banks are stronger and more diversified. But that's not the major point here.
And you were saying that regulations had nothing to do with it?
No, I'm saying that in Canada.
The laws, the Canadian laws?
Well, here's the key, okay? In the United States, why did all these banks in the U.S. create all these crazy mortgages and do all these sorts of things? Because you had a whole series of policies designed to push housing, to increase the level of home ownership, run government policies, government interventions and regulations here in the U.S. that didn't exist in Canada. For example, Canada does not have an equivalent of Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac that will subsidize and buy up these mortgages, that has this implicit government guarantee. They don't have the same policies we had from the Housing and Urban Development that were requiring banks to make certain numbers of loans to low-income borrowers. So all of these things that began, well, they've been part of the U.S. policy for decades, but certainly both under the first President Bush and then Clinton and then the second President Bush, that were designed government policies that created these artificial incentives for banks to make these kind of loans, right? As well as a whole series of other government regulations that did so. Push that into the banking system. The banking, they responded to those incentives. They made those bad loans, and we wind up here.
Yeah, but you came up with a number of products in the United States in your financial services sector.
Because the regulations supported
and these products themselves, the various derivatives, they weren't regulated.
Well,
people dreamt up these various products to sell to an unsuspecting public. And you jam up a lot of people.
Right, but remember that the only reason those products existed, and if you talk to people in the industry, they'll tell you this, was because they believed that housing prices would never fall. They thought housing prices would continue to rise. Why? Because we had this very strong set of government policies, including the low interest rates, that artificially supported all of this housing lending and the flipping of houses and all this stuff. That none of those fancy derivatives would have even existed if government hadn't played this role in the housing market.
Even Alan Greenspan, Professor, talked about irrational exuberance.
Yep.
And this irrational exuberance the members in the financial services sector, those professionals, they were running wild. Okay. That is irrational exuberance.
Actually, but let's think of it this way. Suppose while we were sitting in here tonight doing this interview, we came out and we discovered that in downtown Nassau, there had been 400 automobile accidents in the last hour or so that we've been sitting here. We'd be tempted to say, what happened? Did all the Nassau drivers become irrationally exuberant, right, and start running their cars into each other? I don't think that would be our first explanation. I'd argue our first explanation would be that the traffic lights failed, okay? In particular, that they were all green.
No, we would say if we had proper policies and proper laws in place, you wouldn't have these 400 accidents if people were obeying the law.
Right.
But you had no law in America to deal with these derivatives. And that is why Mr. Greenspan described it as irrational exuberance.
But it wasn't irrational. People were responding rationally to poor incentives created by government policy. Right? They created these derivatives because you had these poor government policies in place that sent a signal to them that says, do this.
But isn't that the same thing?
No, it's not.
If you have poor policies.
If you're driving along the street and you see, and the light's green, okay, and you go, oh, green light, I go through. And it turns out that the light the other way is green too. You haven't acted irrationally. You just have a signal that's led you to make an error.
But